Okay, I'm going to turn the rest of the service over to our visiting speaker, who is, I consider him part of the group. He doesn't get here very often, but Brian Smith. And Brian, I'll just turn it over to you. I need to give you, where are you? There you are. Take me a minute to get this thing done, right? Brian. All right, so Brian, I'm going to make you the host, so
All right.
your PowerPoint will take over. Okay.
Okay, which should give me the ability to, how do I share my screen? Oh, right there, the big green button, share screen. Okay. All right, are you guys seeing my title slide?
Yes.
Okay, all right, good. All right, and my title slide, I got to admit, it's a little bit provocative. I'm not trying to be offensive or whatever, but I have learned, having taught this in other groups, that it's a little, it tends to get certain people's emotions riled up a little bit. So I'm not technically talking about Hanukkah per se. What I am talking about is the end of the age and Hanukkah. How does Hanukkah fit in with the end of the age? So this is a study that I entered because my wife and I are attending a group, at least, you know, somewhat regularly, and they are more along the Messianic scale or the Torah Hebrew roots or whatever you want to call it. And so they keep Hanukkah, and I had to decide, like, what in the world is this thing all about, and where does it belong for me? So there were questions there that I had to answer, but that's I just want to kind of set people at ease that what I will be speaking about, there are things I found out about that I found to be fascinating and I think worthwhile to others, but I will not be talking or covering, did Hanukkah, can Christians keep Hanukkah, should Christians keep Hanukkah? What's the purpose of things like the Hanukah, the donuts, the latkes, the dreidels, and the exchanging of gifts and all of that kind of stuff? That's not going to be the focus. I'm not going to try to be persuading people on any of those topics. And I'm not going to be sharing my personal opinion of Hanukkah unless you guys want to. After the primary teaching is done, we can get into anything that you guys want to. But I did want to be explicit to a couple of caveats to set the stage, or to at least get these out of the way, right? So I want to be explicit with the fact that Hanukkah is not part of God's holy days as described in Leviticus, which means that it's not part of the telling a story of what God's accomplishing with mankind. It's a holiday. We know that was very specifically created by a man named Judas Maccabeus. The history on that is indisputable. Other people thought the holiday was a good idea, so they've continued to keep the tradition, and the holiday lives on. And though I'll be teaching on the historical events that led to the creation of Hanukkah by the Maccabees, that should not be construed as though I'm advocating for the keeping of Hanukkah. A Christian certainly has the freedom to celebrate Hanukkah if they wish, just as one has the freedom to celebrate Thanksgiving or Independence Day. But it's also my opinion that there are many trappings in the modern observance of this holiday that one should be cautious of if they choose to keep it. So, and second caveat is that my purpose today is to learn from the original story and see how both Jesus and Paul make reference to these events at this time of history. And so to do so, to learn from the history, the story, I'm going to be primarily rooted in Daniel's chapters 8 and 11, but I want to warn you, I will be making a couple of quotes from the book of First Maccabees just as I might quote from any history book if I were teaching, say, on the Civil War and what we might be able to learn from that, or quoting from the historian Josephus, who wrote the book of Antiquities of the Jews or whatever. So in my perspective, Maccabees is a history book that helps us understand the details of what Daniel prophesies will happen, but is not part of the 66 books that we call the Bible or Scripture. So, with that out of the way, we're going to have a brief history lesson, but before you groan and tune me out, let me warn you, if you're alive during the return of Jesus Christ, this history lesson will be important to you. The book of Daniel was written about 550s BC. And in that book of Daniel, we have an accurate prediction of history that will take place 200 to 400 years after the time that Daniel wrote these visions that he had. In particular, Daniel chapters 8 and 11 describe the events that inspired the celebration of what became Hanukkah. Now, if you guys, I hope you guys have your Bible, whether it be analog or digital, because I will be putting certain scriptures on these slides here, but I certainly have not captured all of them in slide form. I want you guys to thumb through your own Bibles and see how Daniel in particular puts all these, how Daniel chapters 8 and 11 work together here to tell a really interesting story. So
Brian?
sorry?
Brian, just FYI, we are in our study, we've been studying for the last 2.5 years about, we started out studying about the non-writing prophets, then the writing prophets, and then we got into the history of Israel and sent the northern tribe packing, and we are in the midst of the southern tribe of the captivity, and we just last week finished Daniel chapter 5. Just FYI.
Oh, nice. Well, we're right in that, almost there. Yeah. Well, hopefully this helps you guys out then with your own study as well. All right. So actually, if you guys have your Bibles, open them up to Daniel chapter 8. And we're going to be going kind of back and forth between Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. And for my purposes, these are kind of two different tellings of similar historical events, of the same historical events. And so I want to kind of catch both views in Daniel's 8 and 11 and stitch them together to a certain degree. So Daniel 8, in just a few verses, tells the history of the world from about 550 BC, when Daniel, was alive, and all the way down to about 150 BC. So in just a few verses, we got 400 years worth of history written down for us. So starting in Daniel chapter 8 and in verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. And I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in this vision that I was by the river Ulai. And then I lifted my eyes and I saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high. They were big horns. But one horn was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will, and he became great." So this ram with 2 horns represents the Medo-Persian Empire. That is the empire of the Medes and the Persians. Those 2 different empires kind of blends together, historically speaking. First, the Medes, they came up first, and then, which was the first horn, and then the Persians came to dominate over the Medes. Therefore, that was the horn that became greater, the higher horn. And this ram comes from the east, that is from Babylon. Verse 5 now of Daniel 8. "And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and that goat had a notable horn between his eyes. So this notable horn is none other than Alexander the Great. He comes from the west, from Greece, and he conquers the known world swiftly. So continue on in Daniel 8, verse 6 now. Then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and he ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. So this might be the shortest history lesson you'll ever read on Alexander the Great defeating the Medo-Persian Empire, right? Between 331 and 323 BC, a span of just 8 years, Alexander the Great conquered, starting from Greece, which is on the northwest of this map, all the way to the east to India, and then came back and went down south into Egypt. That entire empire that is pictured on this map was conquered in merely 8 years. And if we remember that this is, in the 300s BC, the speed of that conquest is really mind-blowing, unheard of times previous than that. And that's why Alexander was called Alexander the Great. So now in verse 8, it says, therefore, Daniel 8, verse 8, therefore the male grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. So in real history, Alexander dies around 323 BC, and his empire was split into 4 separate kingdoms. With the map that I'm showing on the screen, you notice that this map is from approximately 300 BC. And you can see that there's 4 colored kingdoms that the original empire was split into. But Brian, you might say, well, how do you know this is the Medo-Persian Empire? How do you know this is Alexander the Great? And I think that's a fair question, and I appreciate you guys asking it. But this is a prophecy unique in the Bible, as far as I know. There might be a couple others, but one thing that this prophecy does is it interprets itself. We don't have to guess at what it's about, because notice just a few verses later, Daniel 8 and verse 16 now, it says, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I was, and where he came, I was afraid, and I fell on my face, because you're seeing the archangel Gabriel. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and he stood me upright and he said, look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. For at the appointed time, the end shall be. The ram which you, here's the interpretation, verse 20 here. The ram which you saw having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Oh, the the Medo-Persian Empire. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, which is going to happen in the future, right? So they're not named. 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. So we know that it's about the Medo-Persian Empire. That's where the story starts. And then real history, as it plays out over the centuries, matches exactly with this prophecy that's recorded here in Daniel chapter 8. So between 323 and 175 BC, those nations, those 4 nations, they war against each other for supremacy. And then by 175 BC, there's really only 2 nations or 2 kind of regions remaining. The others have been kind of consolidated into the other 2. So you really only have 2 kings left. You've got the Seleucid kingdom based out of Antioch in what we would call modern day Syria. That one's to the north. And then to the south in the Egyptian area, you have the Ptolemaic kingdom based out of Alexandria in modern day Egypt. Now, Here we have a map showing these two regions from the years 175 to 164 BC. And notice that the Jewish people lived right in the land between these two kingdoms. And as Daniel is writing, he uses language from his own perspective. And so when he talks about the Seleucid kingdom, he talks about the kingdom of the north, because from the perspective of one living in Israel or Jerusalem, that would be to the north of Jerusalem. And then the kingdom to the south would refer to the Ptolemaic kingdom, from the perspective of one writing from Jerusalem. And so we got the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. Daniel chapter 8 still, but now in verse 9, it says that out of one of those little four horns came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and towards the glorious land. So here we're introduced to this guy, the little horn, which is the main character that we're going to dwell on today, Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV spent most of his youth as a hostage in Rome because his father lost a war with the Romans. He had a brother. His brother was Seleucus IV, which the kingdom of the north was named after him, the Seleucian Empire. And Seleucus was the rightful heir ruler of the kingdom. Well, Antiochus was eventually released by the Romans, comes back home, and his brother ends up being killed not long afterwards. Seizing on the opportunity, he was made king over the Seleucid kingdom in 175 BC. In other words, he stole the throne from its rightful heir, which would have been Seleucus's son. Now, interestingly, the reason I bring this up is that this was all prophesied in Daniel. But let's flip over to Daniel chapter 11, and we're going to start to see who this Antiochus man is all about. Daniel chapter 11 now, and in verse 21, it says, "In his place shall arise," what Daniel writes down as a vile person, "to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue." So we already have two character traits of Antiochus Epiphanes. What kind of a person was Antiochus? Well, he's described here as a vile person and a person of intrigue, who commits intrigue. As we keep reading here in Daniel chapter 11, notice some of the other character traits that pop out. So verse 23, "After the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully." That's another part of his character. "For he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, the spoil, and the riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time." So in other words, he's trying to buy friends with riches that he steals from the nations that he rules over. But the kind of friends that you get when you buy them is very different than the kind of friends that you earn through true relationship. Verse 25, "He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to do battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him." So we see the king of the north and the king of the south are still swinging back and forth against each other through the course of history. They're trying to, again, consolidate the great empire and be the ruler of it. But each of them wants to be that great ruler. And so they keep taking their armies back and forth. "Yes, those who eat," verse 26 now, Daniel 11. "Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him." So what kind of friends do you have when you buy them off? Well, the kind that want to take over your power, right? "His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain." Verse 27, "Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil." Wow, what kind of a person do you have to be in order for the Bible to record your character as your heart is bent on evil? And it continues, they shall speak lies at the same table, face to face, look at each other, speaking lies, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. So this is the kind of person that we're dealing with at this time of history, this man named Antiochus. And this is long before he came into reality, right? Daniel is writing 400 years previous to him coming on the scene for real. And this is how he describes his character through the vision that he saw from the Lord. Also see in this passage that one of the goals of Antiochus IV was to swoop down from the north and conquer the Ptolemy kingdom in the south, which means, based on what we saw in the map, that if you're going to move your armies from the north to the south, where do you go right through? You go right through the territory of Israel. So every time the north goes down to the south or the south goes up through the north, they're moving their armies, or move south to attack and then north to retreat or to go back home. You're bringing your armies right through the land of Israel. So those are much of the details that we have in Daniel regarding the history that we're kind of focused in on in the Bible. But we do have the book of Hanukah, which records this time of history where Antiochus was on the scene, and it records it in tremendous more detail in the books of First and Second Maccabees. So again, I'm reading from Maccabees as a history book to get more detail than what we find in Daniel. So here's one quote I'd like to bring out. This is from First Maccabees chapter 1, verses 11 through 15.
Brian,
Yeah.
I don't think this has anything to do with what you're talking about, but I find it kind of ironic that Daniel has been taken as a captive in the first wave of Nebuchadnezzar's attack on Jerusalem. He's taken, he's in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, and then he sees Cyrus come in so he's already seen two changing of the guards, and now he's writing about two or three other changing of the guards. I just find that kind of unique, I guess.
Yeah. And his prophecies were spot on, right? As we go through the next 400 years of history, like every detail is exactly correct, which is just, you know, we can celebrate what an awesome God we serve, right? Who knows the end from the beginning and shares it with his people. Yeah, so during this time in history under Antiochus, there were some in Jewish society, not everyone was agreed, just like in our society or any society, right? You don't have just one frame of thought, one frame of reference, one set of beliefs. Different people have different beliefs. So in this society, there were some Jews who, whether by fear of death or maybe they were covetous for money or power, they thought that the best move was to be friends with the world. So here's this quote from First Maccabees 1. It says, in those days, certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us. For since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us. This proposal pleased them, it says, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So what do they do? Verse 14 here. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the Gentile custom. You might think of that as a stadium nowadays, right? We want to be just like the Gentiles. Bring in the games, bring in the baseball games, bring in the football games, bring in the Olympics. And verse 15, they removed the marks of circumcision, which I'm not exactly sure what that means because I don't know how you can undo that procedure. But whatever that means.
I feel the word ouch.
Yeah. Oh man. So somehow or another, it records here that they removed the marks of circumcision. But here's the important part, right? They abandoned the Holy Covenant. Some in Jewish society at this time abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil, is how it's recorded here in Maccabees. So some who call themselves Jews abandoned the Holy Covenant and became those who call themselves Jews but are not. That might be a phrase that's familiar, right? Why did they do this? Because they figured that if they made friends with the world, then they could spare themselves some persecution from the world, right? Where let us go make a covenant with the Gentiles, it says, for since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us. So the thinking is, if we ally with them, if we become friends with them, if we become like them, we can save ourselves some persecution. But we know, because we've seen example after example through all of history, that allying with evil never results in a cessation of persecution.
So I have a comment.
Sure.
So this is from our Bible studies going along through Kings and Chronicles and the prophets, etc. This seems to be another repetition of the constant roller coaster that in rejection of instruction by God that the people went through, that from the leaders on down. In fact, it can be traced all the way back to whenever. You can trace this same story back to Exodus, and even before that, about how people did not follow what God said, etc. So, this is just another iteration at a time, that we see written by Judas Maccabeus.
Yep. Yeah, totally agreed.
I'd like to comment that, just as we don't know how they removed the marks of
Circumcision.
We don't really know what abandoning the Holy Covenant, what would that be? Just the Sabbath? Would it be clean foods? What exactly was that?
Yeah, well, if I can put a pause button on that one, I'll get closer to an answer on that one.
Okay.
Are we talking about Judah or Israel or all of the above?
So Israel, when they were taken captive into Babylon first, if I have my history right.
But I mean, the Maccabees right here.
So the Maccabees would have been those who came back from Babylonian captivity.
Okay.
After they were freed by, what was that king? Cyrus, thank you. And then they came back and they started to rebuild the temple.
Okay, I've got it.
That would be the Jews.
I was just out of place in time.
Sorry, Mark, say that again.
I was going to say that's your tribes that went into captivity from to Babylon, which is basically the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, with some possible other hangers on. But correct. Israel, remember, the 10 tribes, they were exiled, took into exile up into by Assyria, way in
right.
far-flung areas that we have lost track of.
Yeah, and they've been gone for what, 500 years? Daniel was 550 BC.
Yeah, they went into captivity in 700, 720, 718.
Yeah. So they're long gone. This is Judah, the southern tribes, right, Brian?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in fact, I recently kind of put two pieces together I had not before, that this Maccabean revolt time period that we're talking about right here is the birth of the Pharisaical system. So the Pharisees that are on the scene with Jesus and constantly creating strife, they pretty well started. They formed the first mention of Pharisee as a name started right here at this time of history. All right. All right, so back on track. In 170 BC, Antiochus makes a play for Egypt. He goes down, takes his armies, goes down into Egypt, and has some plunder down there, has some success, and he comes back through on his way back from Egypt to his capital city of Antioch. He stops in Jerusalem with his armies, and just as predicted in Daniel 11 and verse 28, he robs God's temple of its treasures. We can read that in Daniel 11:28. It says, while returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage, it says in New King James, and then return to his own land. So what does it mean to do damage, right? And this is where Maccabees gives us some details on what this really looked like. So I'm going to be quoting again from First Maccabees here, chapter 1, verse 20. It says, after subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned in the 143rd year, and he went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. It says that he arrogantly entered the sanctuary, and he took, here we go, it says he took the golden altar, he took the lampstand with the light and all of its utensils, he took the table from the bread of the presence, he took the cups for drink offerings, he took the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, he took the crowns, he took the gold decoration off of the front of the temple. I think he stripped the gold straight off of the walls. He stripped it all off, it says. It says he took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels. He took also the hidden treasures that he found. Taking them all, he went into his own land. And it wraps up by saying he shed much blood and spoke with great arrogance. So anything, he came in like a big bully and said, I'm taking this, I'm taking this, I'm taking this, and he took it all for himself. 2 years later, so we're at 168 BC now, he tried to finish his conquest of the Ptolemies, but the second invasion was not successful. The Romans stopped him from proceeding before he could enjoy the spoils of his victory. So we read that actually in Daniel chapter 11, now verse 29. It says, at the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved. And here's the important part, he will return in rage against the holy covenant, and here's that phrase again, do damage. So Antiochus was humiliated from being defeated down south, outraged from this defeat. He turns his fury towards Jerusalem and towards the Jewish people. If he couldn't have Egypt, he would at least have Israel. And so that starts a period of time called Hellenization. Really, it was a brutal campaign against Jews and the Jewish culture at that time. So still in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 30, it says that he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. He shall show regard, it says, for those who forsake the holy covenant. Verse 31, Daniel 11:31, forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortresses, but they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. So this phrase, the abomination of desolation, is prophetically important. It's mentioned only 4 times in the Bible. Twice here in Daniel. This is one of the 2 times in Daniel, and then twice in the New Testament. This is the first occurrence where we read it in Daniel. I won't be covering the second one. I'll be describing in more detail the abomination of desolation, but allow me to describe it in the context of the larger story, because this gets to the answer to the question of, what does it mean to come against, to do damage, or to come against the Holy Covenant? So here's the story of that. So in a sleight of hand, Antiochus and his army approached Jerusalem as though they were coming in a peaceful manner. But once the troops entered the city, they turned on the Jewish people, killing many of them, destroying the city, stealing their goods. The goal that Antiochus had was to destroy Judaism by making its observance illegal. Anything about the religion of Judaism or the culture of Judaism became illegal under pain of death. Everything Jewish became banned, and he forced that the Greek religion and culture had to be kept by all the Jews. And this is what is called, the word Hellenization is used for that. Nowadays, we would call it ethnic cleansing, but it's the same basic idea that the old culture will be done away with and it will be replaced with the new people and the new culture.
Okay, I need to catch up here for just a second.
Sure.
All right, so Nebuchadnezzar, we'll go back a few years. Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem, and in the first wave, he took some of the gold and the treasures from the temple. Then he came in the second time and took, I guess, most of the rest of it and burned everything down, burned the temple down, burned the city down. So this is all in Babylon now. So now with Nehemiah and Ezra, they took the gold and things back when they kind of rebuilt the temple, and so they've taken the stuff back. And so now Antiochus is taking it again, right? That's kind of right?
That's correct. So if we call the Daniel Solomon temple the first temple, which was destroyed, you're right, by Nebuchadnezzar, and then the second temple from the Ezra Nehemiah time frame. Yeah, so he's ransacking that second temple.
Okay.
So now more specifically, what does it mean to come against the covenant and to do damage? So in Antiochus's attempt to destroy the worship of the one true God and the Levitical sacrificial system, here are, things that Maccabees tells us he specifically did to do that. So he organized an attack on Jerusalem on the Sabbath, knowing that the Jews would not fight. And in fact, they did not. They held their peace on purpose, and they came against them and they slaughtered them with no fighting back, because it was the Sabbath, in honor of the Sabbath, which is mind-blowing. That was the decision that they made, those Jews made at that point in time. And in fact, later Jews looked at that example and said, that's not going to happen to us. The Antiochus and his men destroyed much of the city. They slaughtered men, women, children, didn't matter, no regard for human life. They put to death anyone found having the book of the law. If you have any part of it in your home, you were put to death. If you had a synagogue and you wanted to protect it, you were put to death. They enslaved and murdered many Jewish people. They ordered that many altars to their gods, right? Because the Roman system had a whole pantheon of gods to choose from. They ordered that many altars must be erected in every Jewish town. They ordered that all local communities must worship and eat the flesh of pigs in order to prove their conversion from Judaism. So again, everything that was Jewish, either of religion or culture, became illegal in order to prove that you were converting away from Judaism and becoming Hellenized, or like the Romans. They commanded you must eat the flesh of pigs. They forbid all Jews from practicing their faith, including the practices of circumcision, the reading of the Torah, observance of the Sabbath, and the daily sacrifices. So the whole temple system was eradicated, torn down. And they sent an army to Jerusalem to dedicate that temple, the temple of Yahweh, to the gods of Olympia and Zeus in December of 168 BC. Some say it was 167, but it's close. We'll call it close enough. During that time, in the temple of Yahweh, they put up a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering on the 15th of Kislev, the Jewish month of Kislev, and they offered a sacrifice of pig to it on the 25th of Kislev. Now, it just so happens that particular year that the 25th of Kislev and the 25th of December were the same day. So he sprinkled the blood in the Holy of Holies. The swine's broth was poured on the holy scroll of the laws. The scrolls containing the word of God were then ripped in pieces and burned. So what's the point here? What's he trying to do? He is trying to absolutely humiliate, defeat, destroy the Holy One of Israel, the Yahweh, right? This is the abomination of desolation that is spoken of by the prophet Daniel. He wanted to not only defeat Israel's armies, but defeat Israel's culture, humiliate their God, and thereby assimilate them into the Greek culture, as though you're somehow going to win the people's hearts by, smashing their face. He looked at Hellenization as a way of integrating the Jews into his empire socially, and therefore unifying his empire. So when you hear the word Hellenization, that's what it's all about, and it ends with, or kind of the pinnacle of it is the abomination that causes desolation. So what is the abomination? Is that which was abominable was done in God's temple, and it caused desolation of the temple. The temple was no longer usable for sacrifices, for things of God, because it had been desecrated by these activities. So clearly through all of this, Antiochus wanted to make a name for himself. There were several Syrian kings named Antiochus. It was actually a common name at that point. So this particular man chose the title Epiphanes, or even Theos Epiphanos, to distinguish himself from the others.
I think there were 7 cities named Antioch after. Now, is this Seleucus's grandson?
Seleucus's
One of the generals.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. So he had a brother named Seleucus IV, and he's Antiochus IV. So
okay. So the Hellenization spread up through Asia Minor and all the way over to to the Aegean Sea. So when Paul made his ministry trips up through there, he was running into all of this Hellenization. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, and you might recall there were, in the time of Jesus, there were Hellenist Jews who came and asked him a question. You might recall that.
Yep. Who's going to say?
Yep. And they are kind of leftovers from this period of history and on. Those who thought that being friends with the Gentiles, being friends with the Romans, was a decent thing to do, or a reasonable plan of action.
I just wanted to say, this is where the concept of the half Torah came from. If you go to a synagogue, they'll read the weekly Torah portion, and then they'll read the half Torah. What is the half Torah? The half Torah is a portion of something else that reminds them of the Torah. And when Jesus goes to the synagogue, he doesn't read from the Torah; he reads from the half Torah. I forget what it is, but it's from one of the prophets
Isaiah.
that prophesy Christ's return.
Yeah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Yeah. So here's a coin, which is of Antiochus IV, dated between 168 and 164. This coin was minted during the time that Antiochus committed these awful atrocities. On the left side, which is showing the obverse, we see the face of Antiochus IV. That is his likeness, apparently. On the other side, showing the reverse, we see the god Zeus depicted sitting there on his throne. He's seated on a throne with a scepter in his hand, and the goddess Nike on the other hand. I'd never realized that Nike, as in Nike, the shoe brand, was a goddess. It just never occurred to me, but there you go. And you notice that there's Greek letters on the left, on the right, and underneath on the coin. And it reads as follows. On the left, it says King Antiochus. On the right, it says God manifest. And below, it says bringer of victory. So here's a coin that he made to kind of celebrate himself, right? Now,
Nike,
in our modern...
Nike is the goddess of victory.
Yeah. But by the text that's on it, he applies that to himself, right?
Right.
King Antiochus, who is God manifest, bringer of victory. But
yeah,
you're right.
I'm going to say he's the manifest one. And he is so powerful, he has destroyed Yahweh from his position in Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah, so in our modern language, the word epiphany, I use that word somewhat regular. Oh, I just had an epiphany, right? And it means to have a sudden manifestation or perception of the essential nature or meaning of something. Oh, I just figured it out. I had an epiphany. But at this time, the Greek word was used to describe the manifestation specifically of a deity to a worshiper. So for Antiochus to take this name upon himself reveals how he thought of himself to be God incarnate, that he was the epiphany. He was the manifestation of the deity to his worshipers, and indicates the extent of his arrogance against the one true God. In fact, we see this in Daniel chapter 11. In Daniel 11 and verse 36, this is how it describes Antiochus. Daniel 11:36 says, "Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god. He shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper until the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done." Verse 37, "He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses, and a God which his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign God, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many, and divide the land for gain." So Antiochus, during that abomination that causes desolation, he stood in God's temple and declared himself to be God manifest. We see that in Daniel 8, right? So Daniel 8 and 11 are parallel tellings of the same story. Flipping back to Daniel chapter 8 for just a moment here. Daniel 8 and in verse 9 it says, out of one of the four horns, I believe, out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, towards the glorious land. We've read that already. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. Verse 11, he even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. There again is reference to the abomination that causes desolation. Verse 12, because of his transgression, an army was driven over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. for the time that God allowed him at least to prosper. Verse 13, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the certain one who was speaking, how long will be the vision concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of the desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 days, I think the literal meaning of that is evening mornings, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. So 2,300 evening mornings. And my understanding, so this is a little probably contentious. I'm not going to take a hard stance on it, but my understanding is that is a counting of the evening and morning sacrifices. So if you take 2,300 and divide it by 2, you end up with 1,150 actual days. You can actually see that in other translations other than the New King James. They make that a little more clear. But I'm not going to take a big, huge stance on that one. So, so he takes on the name of a god. He exalts himself as a god. Specifically, he connected himself with the sun god. So on the birth of the sun, which is, we all know, December 25th, he set up an idol of himself and sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple at Jerusalem. Because of this desecration, he successfully ceased the sacrifices of the temple for 1,150 days. And because of this abomination, the temple became desolate. Now, interestingly, his enemies referred to him not as Epiphanes, but as Epimanes, which in Greek means madman, which I found to be a chuckle when I learned that.
You had said earlier that, or read, I don't remember, that the curtain was taken down.
Yeah.
So it's just one room now. It's not the holy place and the most holy place. Do we know if he went in the most holy place and that's where he, made his offering, or was this just one big room now?
I don't know if it's told that explicitly. You can read First Maccabees chapter 1. It went through all those details that I just quoted. The way that I imagine it, because I also describe in pretty good detail how they had to repair everything after the 3 years of desolation. The way that I read it, I just envision in my mind of, beams are knocked over and the roof is falling in and the floor is a total wreck and pottery is smashed. Yeah, I just imagine a total wreck of a place. And probably, yes, it was no longer separated into separate rooms that were kept neat and tidy.
Okay.
So knowing, as Brian has described, the character of this individual, Antiochus, I would find it and what his goal was to destroy the Jews' view of Yahweh. It would be extremely unlikely that he did not go into that area. That would leave him vulnerable to accusations that said, well, he said this, but he didn't go into the Holy of Holies. He undoubtedly went in there. And so.
Now, remember that one little line it said he even found things that were hidden and took everything hidden he can find. So it specifically did not mention the Ark of the Covenant in the list of things that he took. So maybe that was secreted away. But yeah, I totally agree with that. Undoubtedly, he went in and caused as much embarrassment and humiliation as he possibly could. So I hope when we're reading through this, as familiar as y'all are with scripture, I hope you're hearing phrases like man of sin and lawless one and antichrist, right? The prophetic man of lawlessness who is to come will follow a very similar pattern to the past example of Antiochus IV. And that's why it's important to learn this history, because there is one coming who will be in the spirit of what has been. This historical example reminds us of how important it is to hold on to the commandments of God. And now in Daniel 8 here, there's a character described that we could interpret as Antiochus IV, or maybe it's the future Antichrist, or both. So let's read Daniel chapter 8. I'm going to start in verse 23 here. Notice this is in poetic form in your Bible, as though we're reading a poem. It says, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. By whose power then, I wonder? He shall destroy fearfully. He shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. Remember that phrase. We'll come back to it before we're done. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. So Antiochus certainly fits this description, but as we put the whole canon of Scripture together, we'll see that there's a sense that this refers to one who will come just before the return, the second coming of Jesus Christ. The Antichrist will also be broken without human hands, probably literally by Jesus Christ himself. We'll get to that soon. I'll read that scripture and we'll see a New Testament scripture that shows that to be true. So kind of wrapping up this history time and how it plays in with Hanukah. So as might be true at any time in history, in a situation like this, when you have a great military power that is coming against a people, right? If you were there, you basically have four choices. One, you can go along with the conquering force, try to become their friends, try to get along with them so that you are not suffering from their wrath. Two, you can stand for what you believe, but because their power is so great compared to yours, you'll end up dying. You'll be put to death for what you believe. Three, you can try to flee to a safer part of the world. Or four, you can stand against them and fight back with whatever you have available. So here in Daniel, flipping back to Daniel 11 and verse 32, we get this really great line. It says, Daniel 11:32, it says, "Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery." So those are the people who go along. He's going to corrupt them with flattery. They're going to have quote unquote peace because he's going to spare them because they're going along with his plan and what he wants. They're doing wickedly against the covenant to do so, but that's the choice that they make. But it says, "But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits," is how it says it in the New King James. I think that's just a fantastic line. Those who would agree to betray their faith were promised riches, positions of authority. But as Jesus asked, what profit is it to a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Whether to avoid death or to receive power and riches, some of the Jewish people did compromise, but many others did not compromise and were put to death. They were martyred for the cause that they believed in. Quoting again from 1 Maccabees chapter 1, this time from verse 60, says, "According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families were put to death, and those who circumcised them were put to death, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant. And they did die, it says in Maccabees. Verse 64 ends with very great wrath came upon Israel. So there, those were those who chose to stand up for what they believe and end up dying for their belief. But there were some who chose to rise up in revolt. There were some who chose to rise up in strength. And as it says here in Daniel, they carried out great exploits. Here again is where the book of Maccabees fills in a lot of details on the fulfillment of the prophecy in Daniel. The Maccabean revolt began when a delegate of Antiochus IV. So remember, we're like 3 years into, the atrocities that are going on against the whole land of Israel. And a delegate of Antiochus IV, this guy was named Apelles. He came into a certain town, Modlin was the name of the town, and he attempted to force the priest of Modlin, whose name was Mattathias Maccabee, to sacrifice to a pagan deity on pain of death, right? You either do this thing or you're going to die. Here's how it's phrased in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verse 17. It says, then the king's officers spoke to Mattathias as follows. You're a leader, honored and great in this town and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all the Gentiles and all the people of Judah and those that are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts. So there's the flattery, right? Trying to get them to compromise with what they know is the right thing to do. Well, as it turns out, Mattathias refuses. But this other Jew steps forward and volunteers to perform the sacrifice. And as the story is told in Maccabees, overcome by righteous anger, Mattathias pulls out his sword and he kills both the Seleucid delegate and the errant Jew upon that altar. And the Maccabean revolt begins. And in a scene worthy of the movie Braveheart, it says, then Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me. And then he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the town. And that's the spark of the Maccabean uprising, the Maccabean revolt. So God raised up this band of Jewish guerrilla fighters led by one of Mattathias' sons, whose name is Judas Maccabee, also called Judah the Hammer. He was a priest, but he was also a military leader from a kingdom of priests. And they were always outnumbered, yet with faith in God and a stout heart, they triumphed in battle after battle, and indeed carried out great exploits. Then the soldiers of Antiochus, who were the best fed, they were the best trained troops in the east. Since the Maccabees were always outnumbered and undersupplied, they turned to more creative devices and relied on their knowledge of the hill country and employed guerrilla warfare. We see this actually in Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 11 and in verse 33, it says, and those of the people who understand shall instruct many. And my question is, instruct many in what? During this time of war, during this time of uprising, during this time of being oppressed by an outside force. Those who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. In other words, anytime you have an occupying force, and then you have those who are resistant against the empire, against the occupying force. Maybe it's in World War II, right? You got the Nazis taking over your town, and you don't support the Nazis. You want to fight against them, but you're not brave enough to be a frontline soldier. So you will help them out as much as you're able to, right? Without, but you're going to do it secretly by intrigue. Verse 35, Daniel 11:35, and some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, to purify them and to make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. So, exactly as prophesied by Daniel, within 3 years, the Syrian invaders were driven from the land, and the focus changed to the cleansing of the temple. And it turns out on the 25th day of Kislev again, which is in the November to December timeframe, in 165 BC, 3 years after its desecration, the temple and the altar were rededicated back to God. It was cleaned up, it was put back together, and rededicated with the ashes of the heifer. Judah also commanded that the pagan altar be torn down and Yahweh's altar rebuilt. And they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and joyfully offered burnt offerings. So that's actually clearly described in 1 Maccabees chapter 4, verse 59. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season, the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Kislev. Now remember, that's 25th of Kislev, which is a Hebrew month, not the 25th. Don't confuse that with the 25th of December. So Hanukkah commemorates the rededication of the temple 3 years after the abomination that causes desolation. In fact, the word Hanukkah, just to kind of take the mystique out of it, the word Hanukkah means dedication. So it's a celebration of that rededication back to God. Now, the story's not over at that point. There's a whole lot of work left that needs to be done to clear the land of all the enemy forces, but I'm not going to cover those details because I got other things that I want to bring into this story. And there's much more detail that could be said about Daniel, about Antiochus, about the Maccabees, about how Hanukkah came to be known for lights and dreidels and latkes, but that's not my purpose today. So I'm going to skip all of that. I want to ask, as we're reading through Daniel, did you notice how many times the end was mentioned? So I've listed them here for our remembrance, right? The Daniel 8:17, the vision refers to the time of the end. Daniel 8:19, at the appointed time, the end shall be. It refers to many days in the future. The end will still be at the appointed time until the time of the end, because it is still for an appointed time, right? So these writings of Daniel and the historical events that we've just covered, they happened hundreds of years previous to Jesus Christ even coming onto the scene. So was that the end? Well, apparently not, because the end is not yet. There is a time, an end time significance to this historical story that is directly related to Jesus Christ. How do I know that? Well, because Jesus said so. So we're going to zoom in over to the New Testament now, Matthew 24. This phrase, abomination of desolation, as I said, is found 4 times in the Bible, twice in Daniel, once in Matthew that we're about to cover here, and once in Mark. Jesus spoke about the abomination of desolation in what's called the Olivet prophecy. Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are 2 retellings of the same story, the same story of Jesus, and they say basically the same thing. I'm going to cover it here in Matthew 24, and where we're headed is Matthew 24 verse 15, which I have here on the screen. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. That's where we're headed. But listen, when I was doing this research into the story that we just covered about Antiochus and the Maccabean uprising and all of that history, I came back over to Matthew 24 here, and all of a sudden details that had never popped out to me popped out in a whole different way. And so I wonder if you guys might have a similar experience to what I had. So let's start at the beginning. Matthew 24 verse 3 says, now as Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming, and what is the sign of the end of the age? That's where I get my provocative title, the end of the age and Hanukkah. right? Most people can name many of the items that come from the following verses, but many miss the abomination of desolation. So verse 24, verse 4 now, chapter 24, verse 4, Jesus answered and said, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, just like it kind of was in the days of Antiochus. And there will be famines, and there's going to be pestilences, because those are the results of wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be earthquakes in various places. All these things are just the beginning of sorrows. Then, he says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Now, that sounds really similar to what we just read about with Antiochus and how he dealt with the Jews during that time. But remember, that's 150 years before Jesus is on, 180-ish years before Jesus is speaking these words. So, continuing verse 10, Matthew 24:10, and then they will be offended, and they're going to betray one another, and they're going to hate one another. Why? Because some are going to try to make peace with the world that is bringing tribulation. It's better, since we separated from them, all these bad things have happened to us. It's better if we just go along with them and build a gymnasium in our land and do the things that they do than to suffer persecution. Some will go along with that, some won't. And so they're going to betray one another. They're going to hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And verse 12, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. That's the end that we're looking for. Here we are in verse 15. Therefore, tie that back with the previous thought. We're talking about then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, verse 16, look at this advice. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, isn't that interesting? Because it sounds just like what Mattathias Maccabees did. All who are with the covenant and sticking with God, come and follow me. And they fled to the mountains. For what purpose? In their case, their fleeing to the mountains was such that they could become guerrilla fighters fighting against the evil and the occupying force. I just found that fascinating. 17, let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. That's exactly what they did, the Maccabees, when they left the town. They didn't go back to their house to fetch anything out of it. Verse 18, let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Verse 19, but woe to those who are pregnant, those who are nursing babes in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. So the history we learned related to Antiochus was a great tribulation. I can't imagine what it would be like if an army came into my home and took my brand new grandbaby and said, this one is illegal, and then kill him and hung him around my daughter-in-law's neck, and then killed us for circumcision. To just imagine the brutality of that, and the it's a great tribulation. But there is coming a time of tribulation such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time. Christ says that if you want to get a feeling for the timing of his return, then look for events very similar to those that inspired the original Hanukkah celebration. And that's why this history lesson matters. All right. So that's Jesus. Let's look at what Paul writes regarding the one who will come in the spirit of Antiochus Epiphanes. We can find that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians and chapter 2, starting in verse 3, it says, "Let no one deceive you by any means." Boy, that's how Jesus started his speech too, isn't it, right? Don't be let no one deceive you by any means, for that day, that is the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. Those are the people who will compromise with the enemy, who think it's better. Following the covenant is too hard. It's too high of a price. Giving my life is too high of a price. It's better. It's easier. It's safer for me and for my family if I compromise with the enemy. That's the falling away that comes first. And the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. Verse 4, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Does that sound like anybody we know, right? That is the personality of Antiochus Epiphanes to a T. And you can bet that the character of that man of sin will be similar to the character of Antiochus. He will want to humiliate Yahweh. He will want to make him to look as nothing. And just as Antiochus was allowed to have success for a period of time, this man of sin also will be allowed to have success for a time. As it says in Revelation, it says that power was granted to him for a time to war against the church and overcome it. And that will come true with this man of lawlessness that's spoken of here. Continuing 2 Thessalonians 2 still, and verse 7 now. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Verse 8, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. So there's two things I want to pull out of verse 8 here. Firstly, the Greek word translated as lawlessness is anomias. Anomias. Comes from nomia, meaning law, and meaning not, right? Not law. And it means one who transgresses God's law. Paul described a future time where a leader will appear who mandates lawlessness worldwide. In the days of Antiochus, he outlawed things like Sabbath keeping, Torah reading, circumcision. He even demanded that everyone eat pork, not just, you can't not eat pork under those quote unquote laws that were passed by Antiochus. This is why it's thought that there will come a time when the Sabbath will be outlawed, as an example, but the coming of the lawless one will be bigger than the Sabbath. Think of everything of what it means to be quote unquote Christian, and that will be outlawed. Now is the time to be resolved within our hearts on certain issues. What laws of God are you willing to break in order to be a friend to this world? What laws, what extent of your keeping of covenant with God are you willing to compromise? Are you willing to allow to be taken away? Are you allowed to be outlawed? It's prophesied that this man will sit in God's temple and proclaim himself to be God. Who or what are you willing to worship so that you can avoid persecution in this life? When the beast system comes to fruition, the choice will essentially be bow down and worship the beast power or die.
Hey, Brian, obviously he's not the one at the very end, but how does Titus, does he fit into this anywhere?
New Testament Titus.
Yeah, yeah. When they
What's the
destroying the temple and when
Talking about 70 AD.
yeah 70 AD. Thank you. Obviously, it's not the same one, but he's kind of an in between guy here.
right? Yeah, you know, I in all honesty, I'm not studied up on that, so I'm not able to give an answer.
You're always supposed to be able to give an answer, Brian.
I thought one of my legitimate answers is I don't know.
Oh, okay. There you are. There you are.
Well, I have a question. So in 2 Thessalonians 2, where is the verse that talks about the temple? Verse 5, he takes his seat in the temple of God.
Mm.
So what does that mean? Where is the temple?
Right. You trying to draw me in that we have to have a
No, I'm
physical.
not. I'm asking under this interpretation, where is the temple of God?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. I do know that we have, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with the Temple Institute, and they have all of the utensils ready. They have all of the clothing ready. They have all of the sacraments ready. They have all of the priesthood ready. They have all of the ceremonies ready. The only thing they don't have is the ashes of the heifer and a um, come on, Brian, where you do the sacrifice, an altar.
Altar.
And my understanding is if you want to kind of parse apart the word, you don't need a whole lot to make a quote unquote temple. And when
You
they
need
have everything ready to go, they can roll it out pretty quick.
Yeah, you just need an altar. Now, is this is before the return of Christ, right?
Immediately before, yes.
Yeah.
Is my understanding the way Jesus described it, right?
Yeah.
Brian, what is, if you go back to Matthew chapter 24 and look at the very beginning of this, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. He said, "You see all these things? There will not be left here a stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now, it seems to me that he is talking about a real building with real stones. And just as we looked in Daniel and his prophet and his prophecies, we saw that there was a real situation where, things were tied into the historical book of Maccabees, et cetera, and what happened. And, this doesn't seem to be a make-believe building or a spiritual temple, because we know that nobody can destroy what God has built and has ready for us. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. When will these things be? And secondarily, what is a sign of your coming and the end of the age? So it looks to me like there is two things. Now, these are some of the things that come out when there are some other type of readings of this, because and then you have this dissertation by Jesus. And as Skip brought up, how does Titus fit in here? How does 70 AD fit in here? So you have this discussion that was very, as you've aptly pointed out, this is very like what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes. And as in Second Thessalonians, that was written by Paul well before 70 AD. And, I didn't look at this and find it out. There is the discussion at the end of Matthew 24, partway down, where he says, he makes a reference of the sign in the heavens of the Son of Man.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm this goes along with the question about Titus, the casting down of the temple, what happened, and how people had to flee Jerusalem at the drop of a hat. There's even the historical thinking or the recording of the voice to the church that said, "Let us remove hence." It's probably recorded by a church father who wrote it down. But the point is that when all this stuff happened, the people had to flee Jerusalem, and that there was a desecration of the temple. And ultimately, as Jesus said, the temple, every block of the temple was broken down. And all we have now left in Jerusalem is a small portion of the wall that surrounded the temple. So, I'm bringing this out because there's some different views about how this all takes place. Now, I'm not denying that there could be something in the future, but how does the temple show up? How does the man of sin sit in a temple in the future? And we have scriptures like, God doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. So, and the church is the temple. Well, we know the church isn't a corporation. He can't take over being the head of a corporation. That would be pretty meaningless. And if you broaden your thinking, you have multitudes of different denominations, for lack of a better term, of people who see things like just questions. That's all I'm asking, and what your thinking is on any of that.
I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you, because I haven't, one, been exposed to alternate views, and two, haven't studied alternate views other than that Jesus in Matthew 25, where were we just now? 24, describes these events, and I believe these to be future events in my current understanding.
Fair enough.
Okay. I'm sorry. I know that sounds like a cop-out answer, but
no,
it's not really.
It's not a cop-out at all, Brian. I'm just, but these are, I think, some of the questions that people might ask. So.
Well, some of the fulfillment of this, you would think would have occurred when Titus marched in 70 AD and destroyed the whole temple. Now, there's going to be another. Let's put that word temple in quotes. There's going to be a place before Christ returns that God is going to consider a most holy place. Sounds like to me. And God doesn't need much, as Mark or you one said, for something to be a most holy place. All he needs is an altar. And so somebody else is coming in to fulfill this seat of Antiochus Epiphanes somewhere down the road. We're not there yet, right?
I don't know. Sorry, was that a question for me?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's obvious there's going to be another place.
Right. It seems that way. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't see a temple being. I mean, if the Jews get in there and start trying to build a temple, all hell's going to break loose. Excuse my language. And they're not going to get very far unless God protect. So I don't see that happening. But I do see, based on what all you've been talking about, and here we are just before Jesus Christ returns, and we've got this guy again. That's a type of Antiochus Epiphanes, I guess we could say. So there's going to be a place like what you've been talking about to fulfill these scriptures. So anyway, I'm agreeing with you. I just don't see it as a temple. 100 feet tall and 100 feet wide. So anyway.
Right. Let me see if I can wrap my mind around what y'all are. There will not be a stone left here upon that shall not be thrown down. And they said, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so you're saying that there will come a time when
this right here happened in 70 AD.
Right.
Okay.
But the sign of your coming and end of the age, is that the rest of the answer here?
Yeah.
So this matters to us, and we believe anyway, most of us believe, all of us believe, that these signs are important to us in these days and times because we're looking for the fulfillment of them in our modern times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, my view, and don't mistake and say that everybody that's sitting here listening to what is being said today thinks like that. But my view could be that you have some prophecy here that talks about the temple being destroyed in 70 AD.
Yeah.
And then if you look, verse 29 and 30 is where, there is a morphing. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Well, what is that? I have no idea, other than it could be the brightness of his coming. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He'll send out his angels with a trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds. So I'm not suggesting that nothing is taking place in the future at all. But my personal view is that a big chunk of this is specifically talking about what happened in 70 AD. Now, that doesn't deny that there could be other things that take place in the future. But I think a lesson, just like you brought up in the book of Daniel, was that that prophecy, those prophecies had a definite fulfillment. What did it mean to those people who were living in those times? Well, of course, we know that there's hundreds of years that go by, but still it had meaningful information for those who were there and what it meant right to them and who they were writing to. The same way I believe that Jesus is saying to the disciples' questions, when are these stones going to be thrown down? When are these things, this chaos, going to take place? And he spends some time talking about that. And we know from historical fact that there was a great destruction and tribulation upon the nation. And basically the end result was the Romans declared that no Jew could live in Jerusalem. So there's a lot that's fulfilled right there. And I don't know how some of this is going to be. None of us know how any of this might be fulfilled in the future. Looks to me like you have to have a temple for some of this to take place.
Mm.
And a temple, we know, the temple is the where Christ dwells, where God dwells, is us, is his people, his called out ones, ecclesia. Anyway, I've talked enough. Thanks.
I appreciate that. So if I hear you correctly, you're saying that this abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet might have been fulfilled at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
Well, certainly, yes, it was fulfilled. I believe that specifically was fulfilled. Now, does that mean that there's not something? I mean, there is something. We have something about the fact that Jesus is returning, and that he is going to cause all mankind to see that he is the real Prince of Princes.
Yeah.
On the right hand of God. That ultimately what we're looking at doing is worshiping the real king, and not all these usurpers or these make-believes that are in the spiritual realm and the physical realm. And that he is the king, and that we will all fall down and worship him, and he doesn't need a temple, and that's not his purpose now at this time, to have animal sacrifices, etc.
Whoever reads, let him understand. Yeah, it will be very interesting when we finally see a milepost marker, right? Where we're like, there we go. That one's undeniable, right? Where we know we're on the timeline. It will be so amazing. We can stop talking in future tense and maybe more present tense. I'm going to put a pin on that conversation though and get back to, because
well, you shouldn't stop talking about anything that you were going to talk about. And I'm not, I was confused and maybe didn't realize that you were only partway through. I should have looked at the top ribbon, because you do have a portion that says the end.
The end, we haven't yet got.
We got to get.
Yeah, this second Thessalonians 2:8 is, this is not talking about Titus. This is talking about something later. My opinion.
The lawless one coming.
Yeah.
So when you say Titus, you're not talking about the book of Titus in the Bible.
No.
You're talking about
the Roman general, the Roman general that came in and destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD.
Okay. I wasn't aware his name was Titus also.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No problem. Yeah. Well, let me try to get back into my flow of thought here and see if I can get back into it. So I was talking about 2 Thessalonians 2. He's talking about someone who is called the lawless one. So verse 8 is where I wanted to hone in on two thoughts, right? We got the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. And the lawless one, also Jesus made reference to this, right? Because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will wax cold. And that is important to understand what lawlessness is. I feel like I have a point on that, so I'm not gonna pull it out here yet. I want to talk about the brightness of his coming. Remember, in Paul's clever when he's writing this. Remember in Daniel 8:25, it said that the lawless one shall be broken without human means. And I said to remember that. Well, this is where I want to bring it back in. Through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit here, Paul has an intentional play on words on the Greek that we miss in the English language. Remember that Antiochus thought of himself as the illuminated one, and that was the Epiphanes. He was Antiochus Epiphanes, the illuminated one. Here, the word brightness is the Greek word epiphaneia. Epiphaneia. In other words, the brightness of his coming is the manifestation of the true God. And the brightness, the epiphanies will destroy the one who is like Antiochus. Jesus Christ is the Epiphanes, not Antiochus. Paul's mocking Antiochus in this, using this play on words here. The first person who set himself up as God in God's temple, Paul is mocking him. Jesus Christ in the future will destroy this false Christ. Antiochus is important historically because he's a type of a dictator yet to come who will set himself up to be worshipped, and this future personality will go into some type of a temple or a stronghold. See, the interesting thing is that word back in Daniel can be understood in multiple ways. You remember it talked about strongholds and fortresses and citadels and temples, and it seems like kind of it could be any of those types of structures. So again, I'm not taking a hard stance on that one. I'm just going to let God play it out however he chooses to play it out. All right, continuing in 2 Thessalonians, now in verse 9, it says, the coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So notice in these verses, the epic struggle between lying, deception, delusion, and unrighteousness, and the truth. The truth is the only thing that will set you free. The love of the truth is the only thing that will save you. And we know that Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. So when that lawless one, when that deceiver comes on the scene, it's our love of the truth that is going to save us when it all comes down to it. So I got to my final top right. I'm in the end. Solomon tells us that what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. When the time of the end comes, there will be those who claim to be of the covenant, but are not. They'll argue that it's better to make a covenant with the world around us, to be like the Gentiles. For when we try to live separate from them, many disasters come upon us. They'll argue that we should celebrate the holidays of the world around us. They'll argue that we should march in their parades. They'll argue that we should take pride in their morals, in their culture, and we should celebrate the things that they love. Maybe we should build a gymnasium and marvel at their sports and their gladiatorial combat. Maybe we should remove the marks of our circumcision, abandon the Holy Covenant. Instead of being joined to God, people who think like that are going to be joined with the world. At first, there are those who willingly become like the Gentiles, and eventually it will become law that you must become like the Gentiles. More and more, the holy people will be forced to choose between standing for what God tells us is right and what the world tells us is right. Is this an issue of circumcision? Is this an issue of eating pork? No, this is an issue of standing for the truth. This is an issue of choosing life. This is an issue of not profaning the holy covenant that we have made with the holy God. Jesus says, do not fear those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. There are many things that are the law of the land, quote unquote, and yet are lawless because they are antichrist. Believe me, when the beast system is established, it will be the law of the land. But let me challenge you, at what point does the law of the land become so lawless according to God's law that you say no and are willing to stake your life on it, whether by submission to the sword that will kill you, or maybe by picking one up? There are many in this day who think of themselves as God manifest. Whoopsie. Sorry, something just blipped. There are many in this day who think of themselves as God manifest, and there is an epic war for loyalty, loyalty to the lawless one or loyalty to the covenant of God. And that brings me back to this quote from Daniel 11. When the man of sin is revealed and he's granted power to make war against the church, we each will have one of four responses. We're going to go along with the conquering force. We're going to stand for what we believe in and die for it. We're going to flee to a safer part of the world, or we're going to stand and fight back. And what I see from the history that we read in at this time with Antiochus versus the Jews, when one man, when one family, when one fellowship stands together for what everyone knows is right, amazing things can happen. As it says in Daniel 11:32, those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Now, if you read carefully in your Bible, you'll notice that the words great exploits in the New King James are in italics. And when they're written in italics, you know that they're not in the underlying text. They're added for the purpose of clarifying what the underlying text is trying to say. The original literally just says that those who know their God shall be strong and they shall take action. But it doesn't really say what action they take. For some, based on what I see in Jesus's teaching about the coming, his second coming, they're going to take action to go and preach the gospel of the kingdom in all the world as a witness to all the nations before the end comes. For others, they're going to willingly take actions knowing that they and their family will be delivered up to death and to tribulation. And I say, let it be said of us that we are uncompromising in the keeping of our covenant with God. Let it be said of us that we each in our own way valiantly take action to make use of the weapons of our warfare, which are not carnal, but are mighty in God, to fight against the things that are vile, to fight against the things that are lies, to fight against the antichrists, the lawlessness, the corruption, the flattery, and to endure to the end, come what may. So that's what I learned reading about the holiday of Hanukkah and how it came to be, and pulling it all into how that history is referred to, that period of history is referred to by Jesus Christ, is referred to by Paul. And I found it to be really inspired, the original history to be really inspiring, and I think applicable to our day and age. So that's what I got. Now I'll open it up. We can talk about anything y'all want.
Okay, there have been so many different okay, Solomon was in charge of building the first temple.
Yeah.
Then we had a split, and the northern tribes just, they just quit worshiping anything, and they ended up getting taken away. But the southern tribes, the temple of the Lord, they thought they were safe, they could do anything, and all of a sudden we wake up and there's statues of Baal and Asherah poles and all of this kind of stuff. And so God allows Nebuchadnezzar to come in and to basically empty the temple and then destroy it.
Yeah.
So then Nehemiah and those guys came back in and they rebuilt the temple. Okay, now where do the Maccabees and the temple that Nehemiah and them put back together is destroyed again, or the stuff is taken out of it, what, 300-400 years later when the Maccabees revolted? Am I following that correctly?
After the building of the second temple, was it another 400 years? Is that your question?
Well, not necessarily the time, but the Maccabees were rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar and then his son reigned over Babylon. They took a bunch of stuff out of the temple, and then Cyrus and the Persians came in and defeated him and allowed Nehemiah and them to go back. And so the temple is put back together. What's the next time that it's messed up? Is that during the Maccabean revolt?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, my
Okay.
understanding is that the second temple was rebuilt around 515 BC. And then Antiochus comes on the scene around 150 BC-ish.
Okay.
So that rebuilding of the second temple took long time, because this is part of the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, is that they did enough to get a foundation, and then they stopped, and then there was all these things mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah where they built an altar and they started sacrificing, etc. But that temple wasn't, I don't think it was completed until the, in the 400s, maybe don't know which way to word this, but maybe 485. I'm not sure the date at all, but so it was around that time frame that the temple was built. And then, like Brian said, what'd you say, Antiochus was 165, 167, 165, somewhere around here, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, but now Antiochus didn't destroy the temple. He
desecrated
the temple
and stole gold.
Yeah.
He didn't destroy it in the sense of tearing it down stone by stone, but he did destroy it in the sense of, it was no longer beautiful. It was no longer, it was ransacked completely. Yeah. It was vandalized.
And apparently it must have stayed in somewhat of that condition. And then Herod started rebuilding it and expanding it and making it into the edifice and the system that was there in Jesus' time. But he started that in 46 or something like that BC. And that's why you have the comments when Jesus said, I'll tear this temple down and I'll rebuild it in three days, referring to his body, but people took it to mean the temple that was built, the physical temple. And that's why they said, this has taken 35 years to build. How can you rebuild it in 3 days?
And that's what was throwing me. the temple was that Herod worked with was partly there.
Yeah, he
Yes.
was rebuilding, expanding, improving, basically remodeling a building that was really in need of being totally redone.
Yeah.
And then the Romans came in 70 AD and did destroy it. And so we now have what was left after the Romans got through with it, right?
We have a portion of a wall.
If we've identified it correctly through the
Yeah.
ages.
Yeah, yeah. There's a few arguments about that. Yeah.
Supposedly, the western wailing, well, the wailing wall is a portion. Supposedly, like Brian said, but a portion of the wall that surrounded the temple.
Totally off topic, but kind of related. Does anybody know how that big old stone that the Muslims march around came to be? I don't know the history of it, how it got there on the Temple Mount.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Do you mean the Dome of the Rock?
I think so.
Is there a stone inside of it? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I think there is. Maybe I don't look at my email.
I think, isn't that the one in Little Rock, Arkansas?
Yeah, on the Temple Mount, you have the Dome of the Rock, and inside of the Dome of the Rock, you have this massive black stone, I thought.
I just thought I always thought that assumed
There
that
it is.
meant that it was on the
right there.
Oh.
There it is. Huh.
But is that part of, see, I always thought that it meant the surface of Mount Moriah or the Mount. But I don't really know.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that at all, Brian. Well, there it is.
I must be misunderstanding.
Well, no, there's a big old rock in there.
Yeah, but not the black cube I was thinking of.
Oh, okay. I don't know, but I'll tell you what, you're going through this study today has really meant a lot to me. I had never looked at anything about the Maccabees. I've heard their names, and all of that, but thank you for bringing Antiochus Epiphanes in, and these are all things. How do I say this? That I was almost turned off about studying because of all of the crazy stuff that our ancestors in the WCG, were trying to, should I say, cram down our throats or just teach us. But anyway, you did a really good job. And now Hanukkah is the celebration of, now define it. Give me a 10 words or less definition.
In its original intention, according to Maccabees, I actually read the verse that is the beginning of Hanukkah. Let me get to it. It commemorates the rededication of the temple 3 years after the abomination that causes desolation. It says, Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at the season, the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Kislev.
All right, so Antiochus Epiphanes, how did we get rid of him?
So with all of these, yeah, I didn't, get into that story. The story does go on past the dedication, and that became Hanukkah. And it was piece by piece. They continued their guerrilla warfare, fighting against the various armies. He would assemble up in an army, he would send it down, and they would, through the hand of God, basically wipe them out. And then he'd assemble another army, this one from a different general, and he'd find a way to wipe them out. And like after a few humiliating defeats, it sounds like he took it so hard, Antiochus, that like he lost heart. It broke his heart, kind of a thing, and he took ill and died. Um, and then another person, one of his generals, picked it up and continued on. But over the course of time, they were finally able to kick out the Romans.
And so Hanukkah was how much later?
Well, Hanukkah started from that time forward, before they had fully done the work of kicking the Romans out or retaking all of the land. They still had work to do for years beyond that. That's the rest of the book of Maccabees, because we only really got to chapter 4, and it keeps on going from there.
Okay, now, so the way that the Jews celebrate Hanukkah, it's a 7-day festival, or what is
8 days.
8 days? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to be honest, I haven't studied the modern way of how they keep Hanukkah nowadays. I just know that I don't. I'll. Are you asking some of my personal opinions? I don't choose to keep Hanukkah. I'll recognize the history of it.
Oh yeah, we don't either. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm,
But I do know a lot of people that really love the holiday, and they're all about the dreidels and the latkes and the different things. The thing that gets me, there's a couple of things in particular that get me, that kind of upset me, and one of them is taking that which God created, that being the menorah, and using it in a different fashion for your own purposes, that being the Hanukah. So God created the 7-lamp menorah, and then they add 2 more, having 9 total of the stems or lights on it. And you use one light as the helper light that lights the other 8, 1 per day, as they celebrate the festival. What I don't like is, one, they took what God created as 7 and made it 9. It's different. And 2, then Christians want to take that and say, see, the helper light is Jesus Christ, and he lights the other lights, kind of a thing. See, Jesus Christ is in the holiday. We should celebrate the holiday because Jesus Christ is the light of the world. I'm like, no, because it's a man's holiday. It wasn't necessarily a holiday that God created. It doesn't tell the story of Jesus. So we're not going to put Jesus into it, just like we're not going to put Jesus back into Christmas, because the story of Christmas, right, in its current form, is not telling the story of Jesus.
I've got a
Secondly,
question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, let me finish this real quick thought. Secondly, what really gets me is the so-called miracle of the oil. So people say that there was only 1 day's worth of oil in its pure, holy form that was able to be used in the menorah, but somehow, because of a miracle of God, that lasted for 8 days, and that's why we have an 8-day celebration for Hanukkah. But that's nowhere recorded in the book of Maccabees. The only place that's recorded, that quote unquote miracle of the oil, is in what's called the Babylonian Talmud, the oral tradition, the oral law, as kept by the Pharisees, actually. And then people will take that miracle of the oil and again apply that to Jesus, and I'm really uncomfortable with that too. So
right.
So I've got a couple of questions.
yeah.
So based on what you've just talked about, what is your understanding about the way many of these things are celebrated, observed, and the history of those things basically being medieval Jewish observations. That makes sense. In other words, we don't have biblical reference to those, but we have a lot of things that have been passed down in the Jewish community that pretty much stem from sometime in the medieval period, however long that is.
Purim.
Have you given some thought about that, Brian?
I'm not so sure I fully understand your question, but if
Well,
anything that is takes fables and then tries to put God into a fable or attach it to God, I'm against. Anything that is a secularization, we take some pagan concept and push it into a holiday, I'm against that. Anything that is commercialization, where they want to make money off of some sort of telling of a story, I'm against that. The modern way that it's kept, I don't want anything really to do with it. The original history I think is really cool, but modern stuff I'm not too keen on. What's your point though about the
well,
medieval part of it?
Just like the things that they do with regard to Hanukkah, and I don't know hardly any of them, stem from something, and it seems like it comes along from, as you said, the Babylonian. There's a record of what they say about the oil, coming from the Babylonian Talmud. But how many of the other practices, which I know nothing of, stem from sometime in the medieval period, that where you have the rabbis or the rabbis say this and that says that, and it stems from a time period even after the first century, and have been instituted since then, basically.
Right.
That there's a lot of practices, it seems like, that come from that, as opposed to having a earlier relationship. The other thing I was going to ask you is, what's a dreidel? What is that?
Oh, yeah. Let me reshare my screen again. I'll go all the way back to the first screen. Let's see, share my screen. Screen number 2. And then I'll F5 on that. So these are modern traditional trappings. This is the Hanukah.
I may need to share your screen again. No, you should still have.
Yeah, I don't see anything.
We're not
Oh, did I
seeing
not?
what you're sharing.
Okay, give me just a second here. Let me. Oh, I didn't click the actual share button. Now you got my Hanukah.
Yep.
Okay. So this guy here, that's the Hanukah with its 9. You got the helper and then the 8 for the 8 days. These toys here, little spinners, those are dreidels. The theory that what I've heard is that they use these to secretly teach the Hebrew language to the kids when it was forbidden, and each of the letters represents some mystical thing, some mystical idea, and if you put the 4 letters together, then it means he is coming soon or something like that. I don't know. The donuts, or really any fried food, you also have fried potatoes. Those are because of the miracle of oil. So anything having to do with oil, you choose that. You create the donuts to celebrate the miracle of the oil, or you fry up your potatoes to celebrate the miracle of the oil. But again, that's a trapping. And then the exchanging of gifts is a very modern concept. And wow, boy, doesn't that sound so similar to another holiday that they're kind of competing against, or the Hanukkah lights, the blue and white Hanukkah lights, that, wow, those look so similar to the red and white lights that we're familiar with. So it's like, I don't know. It just, they keep tacking on more and more traditions that don't have anything to do, in my opinion, with the original history.
We've got some friends that have just started observing Purim. You know, I'm like, you know, we kind of need to stay away from all that stuff. If it's not in Leviticus 23, you know, I'm not going to get involved with it.
Yep. Yeah, I'm with you there. I did want to make one quick little. So let's see. There's one reference in John 10, I believe it is.
Yeah, Feast of Dedication in the winter.
Is it called dedication?
Yeah. Well, I suppose that's a translation, but yeah.
Oh man, do you have the reference?
Give me a minute. Probably do. I had it. Where is my stuff here?
Now that would be Purim, right, Mark?
I think no, that's Hannah. That's
It's-
the Hanukah.
Oh,
It's
that's part of
Hanukah.
Hanukkah. Okay.
Yeah, this is the only reference in the New Testament. It has to do with Jesus being in Jerusalem during the Feast of Dedication. And that is a direct reference to the celebration of Hanukkah. Being in Jerusalem, he would have been in like the place to celebrate it. And it was winter.
Yeah,
So,
John 10:22.
that's right. So it doesn't say that he was there to keep it, but neither does he seem to be against it per se, at least at this time. So, you know, leave it to every person's conscience on what that means or how far to apply that. Some people say, see, Jesus kept it, so I can keep it too. And I'm not convinced by that argument.
Well, Jesus was a Jew. He's going to do Jewish stuff. We're not Jews.
That's true. This is definitely a Jewish feast, specifically, not a feast of God.
Yeah. Like I say, Leviticus 23 makes it pretty clear, you know, the things God wants us to celebrate.
Right.
Well, Brian, I'm not trying to get rid of you, but that was an awesome study. It really was. And we can't have you back till week after next.
So I'll warn you guys, I actually am working on a new, you guys have endured some of my, you know, deity of Jesus Christ studies.
Right.
I'm working on a new one, and it has to do, I'm trying to work through, again, I'm going through remedial class. It's like, I should have done this 20 years ago, and I never have, but I want to work through the covenants, the laws that are in the covenants. We're in the new covenant, but what does that mean? And what laws, you know, what are the requirements of the new covenant? And the reason, again, is I'm in a fellowship that is of a Hebrew roots persuasion, and they have a different interpretation of that than I have grown up in. And I need to have an answer, right? If there's different people, different persuasions and understandings, and I need to know where they're coming from and what is right. So I'm going through that now, and kind of acquiring my own lines of reasoning for where I'm going to land. But I you know, could end up, I might become a Jew. Who knows? But probably not.
Well, that's how you got into the deity of Christ. Somebody had asked you a question and you didn't
Yep.
think you could give them a good answer.
It's the same thing. And that ended up being 150 pages, I think. This one will probably be about the same by the time I'm done. So the reason I bring that up is if you guys are willing to challenge my thinking, I would like opportunities to bring forth, okay, here's where I'm at, here's where I'm headed, here's what I think, and then y'all can give me some other ideas, things to think about.
So we can be your guinea pigs. I think that's a great idea.
and my harshest critics. I don't know.
Well, we're kind of shy.
Yeah, I know. I know.
That'd be a lot of fun. It really would. And I seriously, I do want to get with you somehow and come up with some more frequent studies with you. So we can do that whenever.
Okay. The topic is so big and broad. I feel like I'm going to need some time to even come to my conclusions and organize them. So it can't be too frequent, but can we say like maybe in a couple of months? Can I check in with you guys in a couple of months and see what I got?
Yeah, but I'd like to make sure you understand that there are other topics you could talk about more frequently.
There are, but everything takes time.
Oh, I see.
I could pull stuff out of the dustbin of history, but I like to be, what is the Holy Spirit saying to speak, right? I want to
Yeah.
speak what the Holy Spirit is asking me to talk about. So I could preach on any old thing, but that somehow doesn't feel right to me, to be honest.
Okay. As long as we can get you back some, but yeah, a couple of months if that's what you want, if that's what you need to work work on long enough to get us to where we can make you very uncomfortable. uh, okay, anybody else? Brian, are you through? I mean, is there anything else?
I have said more than enough, I think.
No, not more than enough, just enough. Rod, your thing's lit up. Okay. I didn't know if you wanted to say something. Okay. Anybody else have any comments or questions or whatever?
Well, I enjoyed that, and it gave a new meaning to learn from history. So appreciate that, Brian.
Well, thank you, Barb.
Yep. As I'm sure do we all. Okay. Tom Davis just said his unmute button has disappeared and I cannot respond. And I can tell him right now it's because he's on an Apple. If he wasn't on an Apple, it would work. So anyway, well, okay. Jim Williams, you want to, is Jim still here? I don't see Jim's name all of a sudden. Okay. Well, I'll just do a prayer of dismissal. Brian, we really appreciate it. That was a great job, and we've really enjoyed our study of history for the last 2.5 years, and it was. I think it was spirit led that you started right where we are, right where we are. I think that was interesting, very interesting. So, all right, if y'all bow your heads. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much, Father, that you've given us this electronic medium that we can communicate with each other and worship and talk and discuss from many, many miles away. And we thank you for the many blessings that you've given us, Father, especially the blessing of your Son and his blood that was shed for us, and also the gift of your Holy Spirit, Father, which helps us to understand and leads us through your word. We thank you for your word, for the scriptures that you've given us, and the many people who gave up their lives over the years so that we would have this wonderful book that leads us to you. So we thank you again for Brian and for his study and preparation, and we ask for healing for those that we talked about earlier, and so many more. And Father, we know that the great healing is going to be done when your son returns. And we just thank you again for giving us this opportunity. And we thank you in the name and by the authority of your Son, our Savior and King, Jesus the Christ. Amen. Okay. Thanks again. I'm going to shut it down unless somebody else has something to say.
Thanks, Brian.
My pleasure. God bless you all. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.